Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Developing and Maintaining Effective Third-Party Risk Management Governance Documentation webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will be discussing the essentials of vendor management. You'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our Guide to Your Third-Party Risk Management Policy, Program, and Procedures ebook, our Third-Party Risk Management Policy template, and our RACI workbook and template, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the Related Content widget. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Today's webinar is going to be all about governance documents. So we're going to start with a basic introduction about what governance documents are, and then we'll really get into the various types of documentation, including their specific functions and how they all work together. We're also going to talk about how to mature your documentation, and then we're going to wrap up with some key takeaways before we get to our final Q&A. So let's take a look at those governance documents. So what are governance documents? Well, basically, these are the documents that we put together and formalize as part of the third-party risk management program. And this includes the policy, a program document, or your operating standards, and all your procedures. And these documents really are meant to provide guidance and information at all levels of the organization, and they clearly spell out all the rules and requirements necessary for effective third-party risk management at your organization. So why do we actually need third-party risk management governance documents? Well, first of all, we need to outline the rules and requirements and expectations, and we need everyone to be singing from the same songbook, as that old saying goes. But we also need to make sure that the rules are clearly spelled out for everyone. In addition, we need to make sure that we have documented evidence for our auditors and examiners to show that we have a formalized program. And these documents absolutely are the foundation and the best way to do that. We want to make sure that there's no room for ambiguity, and so that people don't misinterpret the requirements or shape them in a way that suits them best. Most importantly, we formalize these processes through documentation. And when they're documented, it's easy to make them official and operational. And of course, all stakeholders need to know and understand their specific responsibilities, and we want to provide practical instruction for how to execute these third-party risk management processes. So today we're going to talk about the 3 types of governance documents. We're going to talk about a policy, which is the formal document that describes all the rules and requirements for the program. It talks about oversight and accountability, stakeholder roles, and it is a required document for any third-party risk management program. Then we have our program document. Now, some organizations call these operating standards, but this document is the document that details all the processes, the activities, the timing, all of the things that go into executing those requirements that we find in the policy. Now, finally, we have our procedures. We'll probably have many sets of procedures, but these are the step-by-step instructions for executing those processes in the program. So we're going to dive into these a little bit more, but first I want to take a look at the hierarchy of these documents. Now, I do love this graphic because it really illustrates the hierarchy of governance documents really well, and it shows how they work together. So at the very top, we have our policy. Now, the policy is really the only mandated document because it defines what's necessary to meet regulatory guidelines or expected standards. So it's our rules and requirements, oversight and accountability, roles and responsibilities, etc. From there, we have our program document or operating document. And the program really details all the processes that are necessary to execute the requirements in the policy. From there, we have our procedures, and they provide detailed instructions on how to execute each process detailed in the program. So this graphic was also designed to show that in terms of content, the policy should have the least amount of content followed by the program or operating standards. And of course, you may have many, many procedures that support those processes. So let's get started with the most important, that foundational piece of documentation, which is going to be your policy. It's generally the only mandated piece of documentation, and as a matter of fact, having a policy is required by a majority of the regulators. But the policy provides the details around those rules, principles, guidelines, etc. for third-party risk management at your organization. A policy is written to direct and exert influence on the major decisions and keep third-party risk management activities within a certain set of boundaries. Again, this goes back to making sure that people don't misinterpret or conflate the rules. And as for regulated industries, we want to make sure that we can reflect those requirements found in established guidelines. So on that note, if your regulator or auditor picks up your policy and it doesn't look anything like the guidance, or the content is completely different than what would be considered best practices, that is going to be a major red flag. Okay, what about program documents? Now again, some organizations are going to refer to this type of document as an operating standard or even a playbook. But this is your internal document that follows all the concepts of the policy, but then fills in those details around the processes required to meet the policy. This document is for everybody who touches and works on third-party risk management, but it also is for your senior management as well. Using this document, they can better understand the general workflow, processes, requirements, roles, responsibilities, etc. of all the stakeholders. Now, I know a lot of senior executives who kind of refer to third-party risk management as making sausage, as in you don't want to know what goes into it and you don't really want to see it being done. But the truth is that while third-party risk management is comprised of some very complex and interrelated processes sometimes, it actually benefits everyone in the organization to understand what goes into it and how it gets done. Another really important element of a program document is that it follows the third-party risk management life cycle. And it illustrates all the specific objectives and requirements as well as who's responsible for them during each phase of the life cycle. So having that kind of clarity really is going to take the mystery out of these processes. And when your stakeholders are more knowledgeable, it's likely that the whole process is going to take less time and become more effective. They're going to call these desktop procedures, but these documents are specifically written to be step-by-step instructions. So how to accomplish a specific process. Procedures should always be written in a way that anybody can follow the directions and essentially get the same result. So procedures are often specific to single workflows or systems, and they should be stakeholder specific. So when we think about procedures, sometimes we would think about examples about how to upload a document or how to respond to a system request. These procedures are really the documents that are written at that level that's purely meant to be instructive, like press this button, navigate to the screen, look for information, submit the form. You get the idea. One thing I like to call out about procedures is to make sure that the people who are actually responsible for the process are the ones writing or at least reviewing the procedures before they get published, because they are the best ones to judge how things should be done ideally and how they're done in reality. So keep that in mind when it comes to your procedures. Now that we've had just a little bit of background on the different types and purposes of the documents, before we jump in and start developing or updating those documents, it's really important to understand the purpose in the audience as well as the format for each type of document. So here are some questions you can ask yourself. What is the purpose of the document? Who's going to be reading it and why? And based on those two pieces of information, what information and content should be included and, more importantly, excluded? And what is the most practical and easy to use format for the document? Now, while you think about those questions, I think we have our very first poll. Jessie?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is your third-party risk management policy a standalone document or part of another policy, such as information security? It's a standalone document, part of another policy, we don't have a policy, or you're not sure. Hillary, it looks like we have some time to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience.
Okay, let's do it.
Great. Who should own the third-party risk management policy?
Well, the same individual or team that owns a third-party risk management framework. So it's really important to understand that the policy is really one of the foundational elements of any third-party risk management program. And as such, that ownership and authorship really should sit with the most senior person in your third-party risk management program. If you only have one, it should still sit with them. And this is really important because they are on the hook for making sure that all the requirements and rules are reflected in that policy, and they're also responsible for overseeing and making sure those things are happening. So the most senior person of your TPRM organization should own that policy.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or a heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, in the Related Content widget, you'll find our third-party risk management policy template, which is a valuable resource as it contains best practice policy content, descriptions, and processes your organization can use as the foundation to customize and align your own third-party risk management framework. With that, Hillary, back to you.
So before we get into any of these documents, I want to tell you something that's very important, and this is one of your key takeaways today. I want to emphasize how important it is to always use direct and specific language in all of your documents. And this really does apply to all of them. You should use direct and specific language because you want to avoid any ambiguity in the requirements. So first of all, let's get away from the word shall, right? When it's a requirement, you use the term must. If something is prohibited, use must not. For discretionary actions, you can use the word may, and for recommended actions, you can use the word should. Be consistent and use this language at all times so that your stakeholders really understand what you mean when you're stating the requirements. So just before the poll, I asked you to think about who the audience was and the purpose for each document. So let's get into that a little bit and start with the policy because, again, this is your most important document, and it's the one you have to get right. First of all, your policy describes the third-party risk governance structure at a high level and should include core program components, requirements, roles, responsibilities for each stage of your life cycle. This document is for internal employees or contractors that engage third parties. It's also going to be your core document for your auditor or examiner. And in some cases, you might actually be sharing your policy with vendors, maybe those of elevated risk. But because this has happened to me, and I'm also aware that sometimes potential investors or rating agencies may also want to look at your policy as part of their due diligence. Now, all policies don't have to look exactly the same, but they should share some very common elements. And some of the most important information should pop up right at the beginning of the policy. That's your overview, your policy statement, and policy purpose. Let's go through these real quickly. The overview should really state the risks that you're addressing. And in this case, we're saying that the organization has a reliance on third-party relationships and that they're risky. But the organization depends on those relationships to maintain its operation. So right there, you've told everyone what third-party risk management is all about, and in just a couple of sentences, which is pretty impressive. Now we're going to the policy statement. If you've ever heard anyone use the term elevator speech, as in you only get a few minutes to talk about your point, your policy statement is really the equivalent of an elevator speech. It's why we're addressing the risk. So in this case, the organization's use of third parties doesn't diminish its responsibility to manage the risk. You know, that's pretty straightforward. And literally anyone in your organization can understand that statement. So finally, we get to the purpose of the policy and how having the policy helps the organization address the risk. In this example, it basically states that the policy is providing the rules, guidelines, and outlines the structure for how we manage third-party risk. So in 3 simple paragraphs, we've described the risk we're addressing, why it's important to address that risk, and how the policy will help us do that. Okay, so yeah, why are these 3 paragraphs such a big deal? Well, if we're honest, not a lot of people actually read the policy, and the most important information should be on the first page. That's why these 3 elements are very important. And, you know, who knows, they may sink in enough to compel people to read the rest of the policy. Now, there's a lot more to writing a policy and what to include. So we have our policy template and companion guidelines as downloads for you today. So make sure to check them out in the related content widget. Now, we get asked all the time what should be in a policy, how long it should be, et cetera. And again, that download we provide is going to give you so much good information. But the truth of the matter is that policies can really vary as much as the organizations that use them. But I do have some standard advice that can help you create a really high quality policy. The first one is keep it as brief as possible. Now, a lot of times you may have seen or read that a policy should not exceed 5 or 6 pages, which is somewhat of a really outdated notion, especially as the regulators become so prescriptive in their guidance in industries like financial services. For some of the more complex industries, a 5 to 7 page policy just really isn't going to cut it anymore. But that's not to say that you shouldn't try and keep your policy concise. Your policy needs to be written professionally and in an appropriate business tone, but that does not need to be an academic treatise or anything like that. You know, one thing you can do to keep your policy short is to make sure that language is clear and concise. You know, say what you need to say in as few words as possible. So For example, if you had a policy that currently said something like, as a part of annual review on all risks across the enterprise, the board will dedicate a portion of the specific board meeting to address issues and matters related to third-party risk management. During that time, they review and discuss the most current policy and any suggested updates. You could replace all of that with one sentence that says, the board reviews and approves the third-party risk management policy on an annual basis, right? It's also really important that your policy is reflecting only your current processes, not your aspirational ones, because that is a huge red flag for your auditors and your examiners, right? If your policy is different than what you actually do. Don't add information that can become easily outdated, like people's names. Put the name of the role instead. And remember to use that clear language. Again, don't say someone should do something or shall do something. If the vendor owner is responsible for the risk, then say they're responsible for the risk, not they should be responsible for the risk or it's recommended that they do X, Y, Z. As fun as they are, avoid using graphics and flowcharts in your policy if possible, because if they become outdated, it's harder for them to get replaced and it requires formatting, reformatting of the whole document. Save your graphics and flowcharts for your program and procedures documents. And instead of referencing text from another policy, so maybe you have some coordinating requirements with your information security policy, just reference that through a hyperlink. Don't copy the whole language out of the other policy, because that really is going to save you from having to update the entire document should another policy change. And most importantly, do not include process steps or procedures. They do not belong in your policy document. All right, for those of you that are regulated or are concerned about what your auditors are going to think, here are some tips for creating that auditor or examiner-friendly policy. The first one is that board or senior management approves the policy, preferably once a year, because that is the requirement. We want to make sure that the policy includes clear descriptions of the oversight and governance, who's accountable for the program. We want to make sure that we also mention that our third-party risk management activity is always scaled in proportion to the risk, which means the more risk, the more intensive and robust those activities are. We want to have a clear definition of the criteria that constitutes a critical vendor. We do need to put that in the policy. So if you haven't worked that out yet, you're going to have to do that because it needs to go in your policy. We also want to have a clear methodology for risk rating our third parties, and we want to talk about, at a very high level, what those risk levels are. So here's the characteristics of a high risk versus moderate versus a low. Again, policy, it always needs to be current state. Aspirational policies are only going to get us in trouble, so keep it real. We want to make sure the language is active and direct, get away from shall, be very clear about what you need. Don't add a bunch of additional language when it's not necessary. And make sure that the policy is communicated and everybody who needs it can access it, okay? So those are some tips for creating an auditor or examiner-friendly policy. So let's talk about that program document or operating standard. The purpose of this document is to have a detailed explanation of the entire program and how it's executed throughout the organization. Right? It should follow all the life stages of that third-party risk management life cycle and should clearly call out all the objectives, requirements, roles, and responsibilities for each stage in the document. It needs to be a comprehensive outline of all the processes and tools used to execute third-party risk management. But again, this document does not contain procedures. I'll say this again, the document does not contain procedures. Let's think about who the audience is. Well, first of all, it's all our internal employees or contractors. It's senior management. It's auditors and examiners. And it could be, if they want to look at it, for investors or rating agencies as part of their due diligence to validate that you do have a strong third-party risk management program. So let's talk about programs for a little bit, because let's face it, not every organization has one, but they are very important and they can help you avoid a lot of issues if you have a good one. So first of all, they're meant to be detailed because they're supposed to educate and inform the stakeholders. And to properly set your expectations here, these documents are usually quite large and take a long time to put together. But the program document is an excellent place for all your flow charts, your RACI charts, your illustrations, whatever you think is helpful for the user. Sometimes our internal processes are very complex and deliverables and ownership can bounce between departments or even systems. So adding those flow charts with swim lanes or other graphics can really help simplify it for the users. So don't be shy about including them in your program document. Program documents can be an excellent supplement to your vendor owner training. And if you don't have any training, they can be a short-term substitute for that training, although in the long term, I don't recommend that you default to the program document as your vendor owner training. Now, I just mentioned something called a RACI chart, and I want to talk about these for a minute. So what are RACI charts, and what purpose do they serve? So many years ago, I learned about RACI charts, and they really opened my eyes to a great way to itemize and document roles and responsibilities across your stakeholders. They can be so useful when you have a lot of different people participating in any one process. Now, first of all, RACI stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. Now, you may see some variations of this. There's a RACI, R-A-S-C-I, but we're going to stick with the basic today. So the first role is responsible. So this is the person actually carrying out the work, doing the activity. Then we have accountable. So this is the person with the ultimate ownership. So they have decision and authority, and they make all the approvals, but they are also the ones who are going to get dinged if the person who's responsible does not do a good job. We have consulted, and these are people contributing or reviewing the activity, and this requires two-way communication, right? So we're asking them for something, they have to give us something back. And then we have the informed role, which is these are people who need to know of the activity, but we only have to tell them about it. We're not asking them for any input, so they're just being informed. All right, so I did want to walk through a sample of a RACI matrix with you just to illustrate how simple they are and how easy they work. The first thing that we see on the very left-hand side is the life cycle stage or the activity. The next section is the description of that task, activity, and then the columns that move out through the right are all the individual stakeholders. Now, you'll notice that we have included in each process a listing of who's at least responsible and accountable, and in many there's also informed and consulted. Now, if we take the first line, for example, this is during the planning phase, and it's defining the need and benefit of that third-party relationship. Well, third-party risk management doesn't really have a horse in that race. They just need to know that it's happened, and it's the role of the vendor owner to complete that work. Their senior management needs to ensure that that gets done, and in this case, they might be consulting finance because maybe there's a business case that needs to be reviewed or some budget constraints or whatever. Now, you can follow this through. It's very simple to use. Notice that there are some boxes that have an R and an A in the same box. There are some processes or activities where the same person performing the work is the same person accountable for its quality, its approval, etc. You don't always need to have a consulted and informed, but you always need to have designation of who's responsible and accountable. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want to let you know that we have included a RACI workbook and template so that you can use this methodology yourself. You can get started on that, and it is available in our downloads and our related content widget. So go ahead and check that out. I think it's going to be really helpful for many of you. Now, I said before that I love RACI charts, and I think you will too, but if you want to know why, if you're asking why should we take the time to break out all the rules and responsibilities in this RACI chart, well, there's a lot of reasons for doing that. But the first reason is it's going to provide clear direction as to who's responsible for any one process. It's also really useful when structuring your program document to make sure you're covering all your bases and you've really considered what each process entails. A RACI chart can help you identify, gaps in those processes and, let you know that you need to go ahead and assign some roles and responsibilities to make sure that all parts of the processes are addressed. However, those are all great reasons. I love them, but there's two reasons to use this that a lot of people don't talk about, and they're kind of secretly why I love RACI charts. The first one is when we identify roles and responsibilities, you're also telling everyone who technically gets a vote. And that's important because we all have those folks that run around and want to put a stick in the spokes at the very last minute. Now, by telling your stakeholders that they're informed, that means that you, yes, are going to tell them what is going on and inform them of any decisions that have been made, but it also means they don't get to interrupt or derail the process. That in itself is worth its weight in gold, right? If somebody has an issue with being informed, at least they can see it on the RACI chart up front, and you can negotiate how to address that, but it eliminates those 11th hour surprises. The next reason, also very important, is that when you specifically spell this out and you tell someone that they are responsible for something, you can help eliminate or reduce that sort of it's not my job mentality and behavior, because everyone who's responsible will also have someone who's accountable. So if you're not doing what you need to do, then you're going to be held accountable. It's really great information to just put out there very plainly for everyone to see. All right, let's talk about some quick tips for your program document. First of all, use that third-party risk management lifecycle as your roadmap and the foundation for your program, and look at each stage in the life cycle, break down those activities and steps, and you can assign a process to each one. Makes it very comprehensive and easy to follow, and it also helps you put your document in the right order. Make sure you're talking about your current processes. Again, let's not be aspirational. That's not helpful for anyone, and it can be an audit issue. So only put in what you actually do. Make sure you use your program document to give all the necessary details about process timing, what kind of quality you expect, if there's an exception process and how to get one and who approves it. And again, use those RACI matrices. If at all possible, it really helps make everything clear and concise. And speaking of clear and concise, let's use that clear language, making sure that you don't leave any room for ambiguity and people know what you're talking about. Again, be clear if something is a requirement or a recommended action. And, use all the charts and graphics and workflows you want, whatever is going to help your stakeholders understand what needs to be accomplished. If you write the whole thing out, it's going to be something like the world's most boring novel on third-party risk management, and nobody's going to use it, and nobody wants that. Also, don't forget that you can use your program document to really supplement your training efforts, and it's a great takeaway after training is completed. Keep your documents up to date, and if all possible, use digital documents because you can save paper and you can make changes more easily. Now, we're not going to spend as much time on procedures today because procedures vary so wildly between organizations, but procedures are really those step-by-step instructions for how to execute any process. And procedures can be, any kind of format. They could be a hybrid of checklist, a chart, screenshots from your software system, any number of written directions. But we just want to make sure that they address one process at a time and are assembled in a way so that anyone can follow them and get the same outcome. So just like having your stakeholders review your program document, you do want to make sure that all your procedures are reviewed and tested by multiple stakeholders before they're processed, because doing that's going to save you a lot of rework and a lot of complaining from people using procedures that they perceive as bad or that they just don't work. So just to give some brief examples of procedures, we might have a procedure about how to update and maintain a vendor record, or what an escalation process looks like. Maybe in a specific situation, there's a procedure for a contract review or signing, how to upload this, do that. You get the picture. So just some final considerations and suggestions for your procedures. Make sure that they're comprehensive, but that they're easy to follow, right? Pretend like you know nothing about that process, or get someone who actually does not know anything about that process and have them walk through them and see how effective they are. Focus on one process and one stakeholder group at a time. Nothing's more frustrating than a set of procedures that's listing activities for somebody else or some other department, and you're trying to follow them and you actually aren't responsible for those actions and don't know how to do them. So process specific, stakeholder group specific. Consult the experts, right? The people who do this every day should be helping to detail the steps on how to do it, because they know and they're going to be responsible for it. So make sure that they're involved. Keep in mind that procedures change all the time, so we need to make sure that they're kept up to date. And unlike a policy or maybe even a program document, because this sort of the on-the-ground, day-to-day stuff, don't wait to update your procedures. If there's a major process change, just take care of it, republish those procedures. It's really important. Again, I'll say it again, actual processes, not aspirational ones. And then as you're going through your procedures, always think about if improvements are possible. Can we outline and illustrate the procedure in a more effective way? Is there a part of the process that's not working? Just always keep that in mind as you're going through your procedures. Now, what do you think about all of that? I think we have our next poll. Jessie?
Our second poll question of the day is, which governance documents does your organization currently have? A policy, a program, procedures, a combination of both, we do not have governance documents, or you're not sure? And Hillary, I think we have another question here that we could go ahead and answer.
Okay.
Great. And that question is, does the board approve all governance documents?
No. The board only really needs to approve your third-party risk management policy. And to just kind of go into why that's the case, first of all, your board is really responsible for guiding the high-level management decisions of the company, but they're not responsible for actual management. So having them approve something like your program document or your procedures, one, isn't really aligning to their purpose, and two, would be a pretty big time effort for them when they have a lot of other kind of more pressing things to do. So no, only get your board to approve the policy. If you don't have a board, then that should be the most senior level of management in your organization. I hope that helps.
Thanks so much, Hillary. If you all could please go ahead and submit your responses. This poll will be closing in just about 20 seconds. If you have any questions, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget. Thank you. Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I would like to quickly direct your attention to the related content widget. Earlier in the presentation, we discussed using RACI matrices within your program document. As a reminder, our RACI workbook and template is available for download. Okay, Hillary, let's continue with the presentation.
So now we're going to talk about how to mature your governance documents. And, this is when they're all ready to go. Once we get them done, hey, guess what? We need to think about constant improvement. But what makes your document mature? Well, it's not how long it is, it's not how long it's been around, but mature documents always have three things in common. They have practical requirements, guidelines, and instructions which align with all the practices, that they are managed, right? They're periodic review, updates, and approvals, and that they're available and accessible to all those who benefit from them. Now, maybe you're not writing documents from scratch. Maybe you're in the update process. So let's talk about that process and what it looks like, the 5 steps to review and update your governance documents. Now, first things first, right off the bat, we're just going to want to gather all our documents up. We're going to really collect them, and we're going to, sort of itemize them, look at, is this a program or procedure or policy? And we want to start with a collaboration with the teams and stakeholders to really have a discussion about, are these documents helpful, useful? Do we ignore them? Did they even know they exist? What ideas they have for making them better. And with that, we just want to in a very general sense, understand if there's a need to change the structure of the documents. So maybe the format's incorrect. Maybe you are listing processes and procedures in your policy. Well, we know we're going to have to change that. What could be included in the program document to make sure that things are clear and that people can use the document to accomplish their responsibilities. Now we want to take the time to actually sit down and read these things. Basic editing, your grammar and your spelling, all of those things are important, and we need to check for those, of course. But we also want to review to see if the document is organized in a way that makes sense. Is it easy for the user to follow? And does the document reflect our actual work? Are there any inconsistencies or gaps? Maybe this policy is a few years old and it's not really covering all the new requirements, or doesn't really reflect regulatory requirements. We really need to read them and analyze them to understand what we need to do to change them. Now, also, again, if there's associated policies outside your business area, you do want to look at how those documents are describing or referencing your policies or processes. And you just want to make sure that everything is current and correct. And if you can influence the policy, just ask them to use hyperlinks to reference to your document so that there aren't version control issues. And that's just a practice I recommend overall for any document that's referencing another policy. Now, these documents. And one of the reasons we need to update them, especially our policies, is if there's been a regulatory change or a new law or something that impacts how or why we do something. When those changes happen, we need to review the document right away and determine if the update is necessary right away or if it can wait until your regular schedule. We also want to make sure that as we're making updates, to keep a change log or a previous version so that it's easy for users to understand what was changed. Now, if you're completely changing the whole document, You might want to put together a little executive summary about some of the gaps and weaknesses that you found in the previous document and the rationale for making the changes. But it is always a good idea, just for audit purposes, et cetera, to keep a good change log, what the change was and why you made it. So none of these documents should be developed and implemented in a vacuum. So that requires us to have a review and approval process. So the first thing is, if you have a policy approval process at your organization, you need to follow that. But you also, as far as timing for policies, again, their best practice and regulatory requirement is at least annually. Now, in your policy, you should also have a page that lists the last time it was approved and who approved it, so that that is evidence that we can bring to the auditor examiner that yes, that process happened. Now, your programs and procedures, they may not have any specific internal guidelines about how to create, review, and implement them. But if there's not, put a process together to do just that, because when you have a process, it can really help all your stakeholders understand what they can expect in ways of changes when they get updated, or how to submit requested changes or corrections if they need them. And again, having that log of your changes is really important during this process as well, because you do want to be able to answer your stakeholders' question or provide some background around why changes were made. So I mentioned earlier that one of the most important things when it comes to your policies or any of your governance documents really is to make sure that people have access to them. It doesn't make sense to put all that work into something that's never seen or utilized. And, that means that people are not only aware that there is a policy, but it's easy to get to. And I do like to recommend that as part of that circulation for specific stakeholders like the third-party risk management team or your vendor owners, that they actually have some sort of acknowledgement process attached to that, especially the policy rather, because we want to make sure that people, one, know and acknowledge the policy, but that they can be held accountable if they don't fulfill it. So just think about getting that acknowledgement process as well. Now, that is a lot to consider, and while you do that, we have our very last poll question of the day. Jessie?
Our next poll question is, which webinar topic would you be interested in if available? How to write a third-party risk management policy, how to write a third-party risk management program document, A and B, none of the above, or not sure. Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
All right.
Who writes procedures?
Well, that can be a lot of people, but the good thing to remember about procedures is they are step-by-step instructions that are usually stakeholder and process specific. So that's going to help you narrow it down. The folks that are actually responsible for executing those processes should be involved in writing those procedures or at least reviewing them. So what we want to make sure, for example, is if there's folks on your third-party risk management team that need to know how to approve a risk rating on an inherent risk assessment, that you have a set of procedures that's specifically designed to give them a step-by-step instruction on how to do that. Now, a lot of different departments are going to have different procedures, and so it can vary who actually writes them, but the most important thing is that the people using them have an opportunity to weigh in and make corrections if necessary. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Hillary. And just a reminder, if you have any issues with submitting your poll answers, please feel free to send us a message via the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. This poll will be closing in just about 10 seconds. Thank you. And here are those results. Thank you to everyone for answering this question. It's always interesting to see what everyone says. I'd also like to mention that you can find our Guide to Your Third-Party Risk Management Policy, Program, and Procedures ebook in the related content widget. This ebook will provide useful tips for creating governance documents for your organization's third-party risk management program. Hillary, I'll pass it back to you.
So to wrap things up for today, some key takeaways for you. If nothing else, make sure that you have a well-written third-party risk management policy. Should be approved by your board. If you do not have a board, then approved by senior management. And the review approvals should happen at least annually. Make sure that that policy is reflective of any regulatory standards or best practices that you need to adhere to. If it doesn't look anything like that, it's time to rewrite that policy. We want to make sure that everything we talk about, all our practices, requirements, processes are reflective of the current state. Remember, aspirational governance documentation is a no-no. We want to make sure that the policy is accessible and available for everyone who needs it. And don't forget, we can use these program documents to supplement our vendor owner training and to educate our senior management as well. Take the time to thoroughly prepare your documents and make them as perfect as they can be, especially your policy, because they will be reviewed by your auditors and examiners. And then finally, keep that update log. We want to make sure that we are capturing any changes. We want to make sure that we're documenting when those reviews and approvals are being made. So much stuff today. I hope you got a lot out of it. I hope that you are able to download and use the tools and templates we've provided for you today. I want to thank you all for being here, and now I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie for Q&A. Jessie?
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time in sharing some really important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinar. On February 7th, we have our State of Third-Party Risk Management 2023. We hope you will be able to join us. A link to register for that session is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hillary, the next question is, if third-party risk management is not a standalone policy, how should I approach management?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of organizations who start out with third-party risk management sort of processes and details sort of layered into their InfoSec or cybersecurity policies, but they really need to be standalone policies. And the best way you can illustrate that is to understand those regulatory requirements and even best practices, you know, using the third-party risk management lifecycle as sort of the foundation to say, look, our policy needs to cover all of this versus what is pretty limited in, you know, another policy. I think that's a great way to help them understand sort of the breadth of the information you're covering and also why it needs to have its own specific policy. I hope that's helpful.
Great. Next question. Is a program document mandatory or just a suggestion?
They're not mandatory, and they are a suggestion. They're a strong suggestion because they really can help you, you know, just educate all of your stakeholders. I mean, I know all of us are constantly answering questions about how to do this, or I forgot how to do this, or what does it mean when the program document in and of itself can really eliminate all of that. Not all of it, never all of it, but it can help reduce that. But it's not mandatory, but I do strongly recommend putting one together.
Perfect. The next question. Are auditors reviewing and auditing procedures?
Generally, no. They might take a look at them. never say never, but generally what your auditors and examiners are going to want to see is that your policy, which is that foundation for your program, that the processes are clear, that the roles and responsibilities are clear. If you have a procedure that's maybe causing a lot of error or rework, they might zero in on that, but typically they aim their sights a little bit higher.
Great. Our next question. Should your policy include 1, organization's appetite statements, and 2, are there standard appetite statements?
Okay, well, I'll start with the second part of that question. There are not standard appetite statements. There is different as the organizations that use them, but most appetite statements, do have some things in common, like they'll talk about the different levels of risk and give the attributes of those levels, and they'll also talk about things like the likelihood, the occurrence, the severity, and the impact of the risk to come up with sort of a matrix, if you will, to measure those risks. So also, many of them will say we're comfortable with the risk up to this point, or who can make decisions about maybe risk up to the high risk point. It could be, middle management, but once we get above a certain level, it has to be senior management or the board. Now, the important thing is that if you have a risk appetite statement, I might mention it in the policy, and I would refer to a separate link with that document, because those things do change and get tweaked all the time. So don't copy all the language and pop it in your policy. Just, say we have an appetite statement, we follow it, here's the link.
Wonderful. Our next question. Can program document be a framework as executive document of policy? If not, what is the difference between program document and framework?
So generally, and that's a great question, we use a lot of terminology, we kind of throw things around. When we talk about framework, that's sort of the structure, if you will, sort of the overall structure of the program. It is not in and of itself a tangible thing. It's the things that go into that program or policy that are tangible. So you can kind of almost think of your framework as like a blueprint, whereas your process, your policies, your procedures are the actual, the requirements, the detailed processes, and the instructions on how to achieve those processes.
Perfect. And I think we have time for about one more question.
Okay.
Great. Is the RACI matrix used per vendor or the program as a whole?
So it should be used as your program as a whole. And, you're looking at third-party risk management processes sort of across your organization. So even if you have people that are in other departments, you're not directly reporting to third-party risk management, you want to represent all the stakeholders in the process, no matter where they sit in the organization. But we're only talking about the processes because they shouldn't really vary per vendor. Like the vendor owner owns the risk. Third-party risk management is going to do A, B, and C. Senior management is always accountable for, this. So only at the program level, and you can make it as broad as you need to be, but it should never be done just per vendor.
Perfect. Thanks, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Hillary for her time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank and online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, such as governance documentation. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on this site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.